morning, friends, and welcome to Sandhan. Today, for this 1 hour, we shall talk about T.S. Eliot as a poet. As we all know, T.S. Eliot is the most important literary figure that influenced literature on a large scale during the 20th century. He was a genius, a multifaceted personality. He influenced English literature and literature in general in far more ways than any other single individual ever did in history. He was a poet, he was a critic, he was a dramatist, a very influential figure. Today, I have with me Professor Bansriben Kakkad. She is a senior lecturer in Dharmendra Singh Ji Arts College, Rajkot. And also I have with me Dr. Anil Kinger. He is also a senior teacher in P.D. Malavya Commerce College, Rajkot. Both of them are very senior teachers and have been teaching English language and literature for many years. So I am glad to have them with me to discuss T.S. Eliot as a writer, as a poet, as a dramatist, as a critic. We shall see all three aspects of his personality during this 1 hour. Friends, when we talk about T.S. Eliot, we have to consider a large span of time because he covered a very large span of time in his active career. He was born in 1888 and he died in 1965. So he covered almost 2/3 of the 20th century. So his influence and his contribution to English literature, English poetry, English criticism, English drama is immense. And it is indeed very difficult to sum up his contribution or to sum up the area of his influence, the extent of his influence on English language and literature in 1 hour. So we shall concentrate more on T.S. Eliot as a poet. We shall have an idea of his drama. My friend Dr. Kinger shall talk in detail about T.S. Eliot's drama. But for the major part, we shall concentrate on T.S. Eliot's poetry. T.S. Eliot, when we refer to T.S. Eliot, we immediately remember the best known poem of T.S. Eliot, that is The Wasteland. I may say it is the poem which has influenced literature in general in such a way that it is truly an avant-garde event of English literature or literature in general. The poem was a trendsetter. It changed the way we look at literature, we look at poetry. It changed the way in which poets used to write poetry. So a very significant seminal work, we may say, that influenced English literature, literature in general, we may say. Before we go to his poetry or individual poems of T.S. Eliot, I think it would be pertinent to take a look at the overall poetic scenario of the period in which T.S. Eliot was writing. His The Wasteland was published in 1922 and it was composed immediately after and to some extent in a sense during the First World War. So the memories of the First World War were very fresh in people, especially in Europe, and The Wasteland reflects this strong sense of destruction and decay and degeneration that crept into European civilization and the disillusionment brought about by the calamity of First World War. But more than that, it would be too facile and it would minimize the importance of the poem if we say that it reflects the atmosphere of post-World War European civilization. It is more than that. The poetic scene of the period reflects so many more things. We shall see in detail about the various characteristics of modern poetry as such when Eliot came into the scene. It was a poetry of a different world altogether. The world had changed a lot, especially the change started, as we all know, with the French Revolution and with the beginning of industrialization. And the whole of the 19th century saw a rapid and vast expansion of industrialization and technological advancement in England. And then we find that by the time we reach to the 20th century, we see a society that was different. Modern society. And another word that we often associate with and we often hear in with reference to this modern poetry or modern literature in general is modernism. So, how far is this poetry, modern poetry or poetry of the first half of the 20th century reflect this idea that we call modernism? That is very important for us to know. But for that, the first thing that we should keep in mind was that it was a society that was now beginning to perceive the effects of industrialization in Western civilization. The first effect of this was, of course, perceived very strongly in the city, in the large cities, in the metropolises, as we say. And modern poetry is basically poetry regarding or pertaining to or reflecting the people and their anxieties and their problems that they experienced in the city. So more or less, of course, there were we shall see that there were poets who were writing about nature in traditional way also, who were writing about the rural England or rural people. But basically, it was poetry of the city. So we find many references in poems where city is represented, and city was a very significant influence on poets also. The earlier, as we find in English poetry, particularly poets of England, in the early phase, we find this in Hardy and his contemporaries, in poetry as well as in general literature, in novel also. We find an awareness about the problems of city, about the alienation that this new lifestyle was causing to people. We find that in Hardy, etc. But more or less, in the earlier phase, this reference to city was more or less that of writing it off. That is, all right, it is there, but we write it off. We do not consider it very significant. And the writers and poets continued to ignore city. Gradually, there was this growing awareness about the pressures of modern life being exerting a tremendous influence on tremendous stress, we may say, on modern men, and that we find in the 20th century, in the early part of the 20th century. So now the new life and the pressures, as I said, of new life were being reflected in the poetry of this period. So we shall go to the characteristics of the period first, and then we shall come to Eliot and we shall look at his life and time in which he wrote. These are some of the characteristics of modern poetry that are on your screen. abundance and variety. Of course, there was a lot of poetic output, and so many writers were writing. Some of them were still traditional. They were still writing in the traditional way, but some others like Eliot and others were very much experimental, and they were trying out new ways. They were exploring new avenues to express the new reality that was before them. There was not of revolt, a realism, the traditional romantic idea of poetry as an escape to nature. That romantic idea there was a revolt against this romantic idea of life and romanticism in general. So that we find in this slide, and then delight in the sensuous depiction of beauty of nature. Some of the poets who referred to nature, or who sing in the praise of nature, they also depicted the sensuous, physical aspect of nature. For instance, nature is there in many of the poets. For instance, Robert Frost, American poet, we find nature fully expressed in his poems. But now the attitude to nature was different. There we do not find the kind of spiritualization of nature that we find in Wordsworth, or we may say the intellectualization of nature that we find in Shelley. It was purely physical, sensuous depiction of beauty of nature that we find in the poetry of the 20th century. Humanitarianism, the growing awareness about the society surrounding the poet. The poet did not live in an ivory tower, completely cut off from the day-to-day reality. He was aware, and he was concerned, and he felt the agony, the pity of the common man, the suffering of the common man appealed to the poet, and he wrote poetry about this suffering, about these problems. So he was humanitarian. He felt a need to write about the sufferings of the common man. And then we shall see in the slide that some more characteristics. Disillusionment, as I said, disillusionment. This is a significant term. So many factors were working towards this disillusionment. It was a slow and gradual process in the Western civilization. For instance, so many thinkers of different disciplines influenced the life in a very significant way. Hegel, Freud, Marx, so many writers. Hegel was a philosopher, Freud was a psychologist, and Marx was an economist, social economist. But all of them contributed to this sense of disillusionment. For instance, Darwin even, when he said that we are a stage in the process of evolution, he delivered a severe blow to our idea of ourselves. We are no longer sons of the God. We are no longer divine in any sense. We do not have any divine connection. We are no longer sons of the God. We are just a stage in evolution, just like any other animal. So all these writers, thinkers, they were delivering severe blow to man's idea of himself. And suddenly, man found himself without any ideology to rest his faith on. So he felt that he had nothing to cling to. So Matthew Arnold says, poetry will survive us. Poetry will support us. That is what he says in his critical writing. He looked for support. He looked for something to cling to in the form of poetry. But that was a poet's idea of it. More or less, people felt this. So disillusionment in that sense. Science appeared to be very promising, but then later on, we find that science, especially the World War, it shattered our idea of science, and people started feeling that science could be very destructive, and it can no longer hold and sustain mankind. So that disillusionment with the modern institutions of society, various institutions of society, for instance, democracy, judiciary, etc., so many things. laissez-faire or free economy, idea of free economy. It was believed that free economy would relieve mankind of all its ills, and then we realized that it has done exactly the reverse. So this was the disillusionment that was widespread, and that we find in the poetry of Eliot also. As we look in the slide, we shall see some of the poetry is religious. We shall see in detail how this we find religious element in T.S. Eliot's poetry also. Metaphysical Donne's poems were republished in the second or third, I don't remember, second or third decade of the 20th century, and that rekindled the poet's interest in John Donne and his way, his method, his manner of writing poetry. So we find metaphysical element in the poetry of the 20th century. Symbolism, there was a romantic note also. As I said, there was a sense of revolt, and some of the poets were still writing in the traditional romantic note, in the sense that they were finding escapism from the everyday problems, and that escapism is a romantic note that we find in the 20th century poetry. There was this depiction of love, which is a perennial subject of romantic poets. So that we find in the 20th century poetry. And then there was experimentation. Vers libre, that is a French